Fittingly enough, the Poltergeist chat is going to be cursed, apparently.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm a bit worried, talking about this film. Something might happen. I don't believe in curses, but there is legitimately a string of bad luck that's hit people who've been involved.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, I don't believe in curses at all, but there is definitely just a patina of, well, I mean, beyond bad luck around this whole series, right? Around this entire series, it does seem as though a lot of people involved met pretty profoundly awful ends or circumstances throughout.
Yeah, well, it's so tragic, isn't it? You watch them now and you think, I mean, Heather O'Rourke, she just died of a heart attack, didn't she?
Yeah.
Little girl.
Yeah.
I don't know, she was 10 or 11 or something, just died of a heart attack. And Dominique Dunn, of course, was murdered by her boyfriend.
I mean, that case is foul as well when you actually look into it, and the inactivity of the police and any authority, it was just appalling. I mean, the ex-boyfriend who was stalking her was a complete psychopath. Just a grade A, clear down the line. He ticked every single box. She was in danger. She was absolutely in danger, and absolutely nothing was done. Not a damn thing.
Yeah. It was just a domestic, wasn't it? She was an ex-girlfriend complaining about the boyfriend, and it was just sour grapes and jealousy. So nothing to worry about. And then she's, yeah.
Anywho, I mean, yeah. I was thinking about earlier, one of the things I was going to say to sort of begin this conversation is I find it difficult to talk about this film, but I tend to say that quite a lot in these discussions. But my problem with this one is objectivity of any kind, because it just excites such good feeling, actually watching the film, actually experiencing the film. And this time around, I hadn't seen it for quite a few years, to be honest, but it's one of those films I don't really have to, because I saw it in like my formative years. I mean, I can't even remember the first time I saw it, but I was very young, like very, very young. Watching it around this time, the moment the Star Spangled Banner started playing over that black background, just this well of like sensory nostalgia and experience washed over me. Suddenly I was like 6 years old again, 6 or 7 years old, and I could remember like the feeling of the old carpet that we used to have, and the smell of old conditioners that don't exist anymore, probably because they had some terrible chemical properties or something. It was an amazing experience. I mean, really, I came away from it feeling almost like I'd had like a narcotic experience, Really strange.
It's real,
really bizarre.
Memory so strong, it's synesthesiac. You actually feel like you're back in the past. The sights and sounds and smells of the past. Yeah,
very peculiar.
No, I'm in very much the same case with this movie, because I think we kind of have the same story with it. I grew up with this film, and to a lesser extent the other ones as well. And again, I like you, I haven't watched it in ages, but I watched it again for the first time in years, maybe decades, I don't know. And it just created that flood of memories and intense familiarity. I mean, I can't pretend that I remembered every detail of it, but everything that happened, my reaction was, oh yeah, this bit.
Yeah, exactly that. The set pieces, and I mean, the film is very much like, in terms of its structure, is very much like just a sequence of set pieces, isn't it? Really, when it really gets going, when the supernatural stuff really starts to explode, it is this sequence of set pieces, and you can almost see, like in the writing, there were people going, "Oh, they've just had this brilliant idea. It is a fantastic sequence. We've got to get this in here somehow. We've got to get this image in here somehow." But that's not that, and that is not a condemnation, by the way. That is just the way it works. That's just the way it works, and it lends it this wonderful, almost like a haunted house or ghost train ride feeling if you just take it as a movie experience. Really wonderful stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it does have that feeling of kind of a collection of cool ideas just sort of stuck together. And yet it's funny how coherent it feels, despite that. I think because the characterization and the writing is so good, they give you the every character has their own emotional journey, and they're quite subtle, and the way the relationships are written is really good. So I think that helps.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is something that it's something actually I've always taken away from this film, but this time round, that was just the heart and soul of it for me. It is the character writing more than anything, and it's the deftness with which it establishes them. There are just these wonderful establishing moments with these characters that feel natural within the story. It's not like trying to signify anything. It's not hammering the audience over the head and going, oh, look at this. This is going to pay off later, don't you know? It's just really natural. I mean, one of the ones I never really paid that much attention to before is the one where the supernatural stuff has just started to happen in the kitchen, where Diane moves away, turns away for a moment, and then all the chairs stack themselves up, and she just says to Carol Ann, "TV people," and Carol Ann goes, and that's it. That's it. There's no quibbling. I mean, this is the thing I love about Diane's character and the way she, and in fact, most of the female characters respond to the supernatural stuff that's happening, is they just go with it. They just absolutely accept it and go with it. TV people, ghosts, that's it. Diane does not. Even there's not a scene where she spends a second questioning Carol Ann about this. That's just what's happening.
Yeah, she's really enthusiastic. I love the scene when Stephen gets home, and Diane's obviously been experimenting all day, and they do the thing with the chairs flying across the kitchen. I love how delighted she is by the whole thing, how enthusiastic.
And
it's another thing
that like what Stephen's, because he's just come home from work and he's a little bit tired and he's a little bit reluctant, to be honest. There's this kind of hangdog thing going on where he almost rolls his eyes, doesn't he? Sort of like, oh, what's going on now? And it's just wonderful. I mean, that dynamic is brilliant. The actors who play Diane and Steve are just the chemistry between them. They feel sincerely like a married couple.
One of the things that they really do. But one of the things that's interesting is how good a couple they are, how good their relationship is. Like, I have seen the remake, but I don't really remember very much about it at all. But I strongly suspect that in the remake there'll be some sort of theme about their relationship being bad, and they have to rediscover their love by the end of the movie, some sort of redemption arc or something like that. There's nothing like that in the original. They're a happily married couple who love each other, and that carries through the entire film. There's no tension between them particularly. They're different people. They have many differences, but they're not arguing or in any real tension at all.
In fact, one of the things I really loved this time round, and I never paid any attention to it before, and it is one of the sequences I completely forgot. It's much further in, after Carol Ann has disappeared into the other spectral realm, and Tangier is saying, she says to Diane and Steve, who's your daughter more afraid of? And they're like, what are you about? What are you talking about? And he said, who doles out the punishment? Who is she more afraid of? And Diana's like, well, Steve, tends to give the punishments out. And she's like, be angry with her. Tell her you're going to spank her if she doesn't answer you. And he's disgusted by that. He says to her, I would never spank the kids. I would never lay a hand on the kids. And I was really I was really quite shocked by that. This is a 1980s film. It's an early 1980s film at that, that's dealing with a nuclear family. You've got a kind of patriarchal father figure going on here. Diane is a stay-at-home wife, so the structure's very traditional. And yet you have this presentation of a father figure that's incredibly positive. Incredibly positive all the way through, and it's this wonderful through line. And when he does, he complies. He does say to Carol Ann, I'll if you don't answer your father, I'll give you a spanking. He hates it. He absolutely hates having to do it. And I loved that. I loved that so much, because how often in horror films in general do you get positive representations of masculinity of any kind?
The lovely little, again, really subtle character note in that same scene when he eventually does say it. He says to Carol Ann, "You'll get a spanking from both of us." Yeah. He can't, even in that moment, he can't bring himself to be the only one.
Yeah,
to be the dish out that punishment.
He doesn't. Yeah. He doesn't want his daughter to see him as a monster, as an ogre, or for her to be afraid of him. Which is interesting, because that actually plays out in the second film, of course. It has ramifications there. But you see shades of it throughout the film with all of his relationships. There's that wonderful moment very early on where Robbie is afraid of the storm, and he comes into the bedroom, and Steve doesn't dismiss him. He doesn't tell him. He doesn't use the standard paternal, big boys aren't afraid of storms or anything like that. No. He goes with him into his room, and he sits with him for the longest time, and he makes a game of it. He gives him a mechanism for getting over it. And of course, at this point, this is long before anything supernatural has happened. So of course, he doesn't know that these fears are actually going to play off. They're actually going to come true later on.
He's a really good dad. He's totally invested. He takes his share of everything with the kids. It's a really positive portrayal. I mean, some of that is sort of the Spielbergian sentimentality about the family, but it's not just that. There is a value to seeing positive portrayals of these things on screen, and it's really nice.
Especially
I think
right.
Yeah. I mean, so many films of this type would go for the more cynical or the darker take where you'd add some sort of superficial darkness to it by having the father kind of angry or dismissive, or having the marriage in trouble, and that this film's just not bothered with that at all. It's too cheap.
It's interesting that it's called Poltergeist in that regard, isn't it? Because in the actual studies of quote unquote poltergeist phenomena, that is the standard mythology, isn't it? That the children that are afflicted come from broken households or problematic households, and so on and so forth. This seems to just invert that completely. It's in fact, it goes out of its way to establish not just their household, but Cuesta Verde itself as this kind of sort of halcyon, neoliberal, Elysian Fields kind of place.
Well, one of the things that carries through the film about Stephen and Diane is you get this feeling of them. I mean, Diane has a line in the second film where she says, you were never a hippie. But even so, you get this feeling of the two of them as people who were kids in the 60s, and teenagers in the 70s. I mean, that wonderful scene when they're in the bedroom together.
Oh, it's my favorite.
I mean, it's a signature of it's sort of the entire basis of those characters in a bottle, because you have Diane smoking a joint and you have Stephen reading a book about Ronald Reagan.
It's so good.
Yeah. So what you have is like a picture of that generation. When they were young, they went to rock concerts and smoked grass, and they still smoke a bit of grass every now and again as grown-ups when the kids have gone to bed. But they're also, they're homeowners now. He's a writer, and he reads books about Ronald Reagan and stuff.
I mean, they've been swept up, haven't they? They've been swept up into like the experiment of neoliberalism, and like a lot of their generation, they probably had no choice in the matter at all. It's just just the way things are in the 1980s, right? I mean, they even live in Cuesta Verde, which is it's a corporate settlement, isn't it? You know, it's a town it was built by a corporation to serve the corporation's needs.
Yeah, it's almost like a company town. I mean, that's, you know, Stephen works for them and lives in their town. You know, and it's, I mean, the film does do some undermining of that paradise, you know, because of course the whole point of the film is that it's their house, this beautiful neoliberal house where the 2.4 children live, you know, in the ideal 80s American nuclear family. It's built upon a great big load of dead bodies, which are specifically there because the big company that built the house didn't want to pay the expense of actually doing this job of moving the cemetery from
moving the damn cemetery. That's all it would have taken, right? That's all it would have taken. And of course this corporation definitely has the power and the money. I mean, for God's sake, it has the power and the money to bulldoze like you know, the equivalent of a small country and establish a little town on it, right? It's I mean, it's the Gothic, isn't it? It's the Return of the Repressed just married to like a postmodern setting, and it works really, really well. I mean, what I love about the film is it's kind of blunt force trauma about it too, especially towards the end, where it doesn't even make it a metaphor. You literally have the corpses erupting up through the floor of the household, right? It's not subtle in its symbolism, this one.
And they're such good corpses as well. There's something about like skeletal dead bodies in movies from the 80s. I don't know. You see it in the Indiana Jones movies and some other movies from that era. That there's just something about them, like the wonderful industrial light and magic visual effects, the clouds and the lights and things. They have a particular feel and a particular quiddity that no other effects have. You know, those sorts of effects from this era. It's the same with those sorts of physical effects as well.
And this is like an extravaganza of all of them, isn't it? I mean, another thing I absolutely love about the film is that it doesn't really concern itself with believability. It just goes insane, and if the ideas work, they're in there. They just go. I mean, one of the first big set pieces, of course, is with the damn tree, which is an insane moment. It's an absolutely, like, on the face of it, I mean, reading that in the script, you could take that as utterly ludicrous.
Yeah, it dances right on the edge of it, doesn't it?
Really does. I mean, the tree comes alive and tries to eat Robbie, you know? It picks him out of his bedroom, and it is like a monster, isn't it, this thing? It's alive. It's got... Its branches become like claws, and that weird kind of rent that it has, and it becomes a mouth, you know? It's pretty unpleasant. I mean, ironically, it does look very, very much... It resembles, certainly in terms of its silhouette, that H.R. Giger thing that the Reverend Kane actually becomes in Poltergeist 2, by a happy circumstance.
Yeah, and it kind of looks like the Pillar of Souls from Hellraiser as well.
It does a little bit.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me on this rewatch, actually, I don't know, it hadn't stuck in my mind somehow from the old days, but it does actually try to eat Robbie physically to consume him. It kind of opens its mouth and he's actually being consumed. And I don't know, I don't remember being particularly frightened by that watching it as a kid, but genuinely watching it again this time, I was kind of, oh shit.
There is something really, I don't know what it is, but there is something really disturbing about that notion. I mean, like, the questions that come up, you know, I mean, what is going to happen to Robbie if he's taken into this thing?
Yeah.
Is he going to be digested? Is it like a fairy tale ogre? You know, the things that a kid would be afraid of. Because when he comes out of it as well, when Steve manages to get him out, he's covered in this like brown slime, this filth from inside this dead tree. that's another thing this film does really well, actually. It's texture. It layers in visual texture into each one of its set pieces. So there's these wonderful organic effects. I mean, much further on, towards the very end, when they think everything is over, when Tangier has pronounced the house clear, in that moment that's parodied up and down all over popular media. You get the return of the ghosts and of the phenomena, and when the portal opens again, you get this horrible, creeping, like organic fungal muck spreading from the edges of the bedroom doorway. And again, it's all physical effects. You can see how they've done it. It's like there's something inflating, and it looks organic. It looks like something pulsing and creeping across the walls, and it's wet with like KY jelly and stuff like that. And it's absolutely wonderful. It doesn't explain it. The film doesn't bother explaining like what this is or what's going on, what the phenomena actually is. It's just a wonderful visual moment, and I love that stuff. It's like the muck that's on Diane and Carol Ann when they're pulled through back from the spectral,
the ectoplasm.
Oh, love it. Love that stuff.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, some of it's legitimately like the physical effects in The Thing, the John Carpenter The Thing. It's really interesting the way this film refuses to settle on one type of manifestation. It wants to do the very physical, very material, very organic kind of manifestation, and it wants to do the very spectral and phantasmic type, and it just says, yeah, we'll do them both.
We'll do them all, right? And it sees no contradiction between, and I love that. I love it for that. It sees no contradiction between that at all. I absolutely love it for that, and it doesn't make a muchness of it either. There is exposition, there is some explanation, most of it coming through Tangier, of course. But it doesn't really make too much of it. And I love the fact that, unlike in, say, the second film, which does put an absolute face and a motive force behind the malevolence, in the first film it's much more like what we've discussed before. The malevolence is like a palimpsest, isn't it? It's that wound in history again that we've spoken about so often. It's a much more sort of diffuse evil, if you like, and all the phenomena seem to be related to what the people in the house are themselves afraid of. It's like it's feeding on their fears and manifesting what they're afraid of. So one of the reasons the tree works for Robbie is because that is what he's afraid of. We've established that already. There's a lot of shots where, especially in The Storm, where he's in bed and he's looking out his window, and that tree looks like something looking in at him.
And then the clown.
Oh, yeah, the clown, of course.
The clown as well, because he's frightened of the clown. So then the clown attacks him later on.
Who wouldn't be? To be perfectly honest, that is a scary clown doll. I would not want that in my bedroom at all. I would never sleep again.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I did sort of find myself shouting at the TV, just pull the curtains. Just pull the curtains. But,
it's a fair point. Just pull the curtains, then you wouldn't be afraid again. I mean, another thing that I got this time round is I laughed a lot this time round, and I like you. I know this film. I could kind of play most of its key moments behind my eyes if I close my eyes from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. But I got quite a few laughs out of it this time, and most of it was in the edit. There's very early on. There's the one of the earliest intimations that something might be happening is when the bird dies. They've got I think it's a lovebird, isn't it, that they have in the children's room, and it dies.
Tweety,
Tweety, right? And there's that fantastic shot where Diane is going to flush it down the toilet, and Carol Ann just enters looking appalled. I got such a laugh out of that. I really did. Just like later on. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I love the symbolism with the bird, because the bird gets a decent burial, and then the box is dug up again by the bulldozer that's digging the swimming pool. So it's a miniature version of what happened to the people in the graveyard under the house. They got a decent burial, and then their graves were disturbed by building on top of them.
This is a thing with this film. It generally tends to be taken as a popcorn film, which it very much can be. If you want just a visual extravaganza, a great cinematic horror experience that works purely aesthetically, you're not going to find much better than this, because it is just it's a riot, isn't it? It's when it starts to go, it goes, and it does not stop. It doesn't let you pause for breath, really. It doesn't let the characters pause for breath half the time. On the other hand, there's a lot going on here. There's a hell of a lot going on here that really does warrant exploration. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about whilst watching it is that this fits really well with the milieu we've already set up, with stuff like the Stone Tape, with stuff like the Blair Witch Project, The Shining, all remarkably different tonally and visually, and in terms of like their color palette from this film. But at the same time, the themes are remarkably similar. This notion of the return of the repressed, of history being essentially a giant wound that's suppurating, and that is filling with a kind of septic evil that can erupt and manifest in myriad ways. All of that is here. All of that is here. It's just in the format of a Spielbergian sort of popcorn munching extravaganza film.
Yeah, I think the Gothic just has certain things that it does. It's a way of talking about certain things, and you're always going to have certain similarities every time you summon that Gothic spirit. You're always good. Another thing that this film has got that we've talked about before is the idea of sort of layers as well, because I mean, you mentioned the sort of mouth of hell thing that opens up.
Yeah.
You get the feeling that what we're seeing in the house is kind of a compound manifestation, don't you? It's like there's the spirits of the people that were in the graveyard who are kind of suspended between worlds, and I think that's who you see coming down the staircase in that amazing magical sequence where you see figures coming down the stairs.
It's really.
And then you also have some other. Sorry.
I was just saying, it's just a really wonderful sequence, that one, because it establishes something very interesting, which is a connection between the living people in the house and the dead people, the souls that are snared sort of in between. Diane's immediate reaction is sympathy.
Yeah, it's not afraid to. It's not worried about undermining the spookiness that it's going for by also allowing you to have a moment where the supernatural is allowed to be beautiful and transcendent. It's really, there is really good. But
go on.
I'm just going to finish the thought I was going for, which was that you have kind of layers of manifestation, which is that you have the spirits of those people who need to be guided into the light, but you also have something else, something more eldritch, something less explicable, something that isn't the spirit of. I mean, it's never identified in this film. It's just a presence. It's just a terrible presence.
I think Tangier calls it the beast, doesn't she?
That's the one moment I find where the film sort of overplays its hand a bit. I think calling it the beast, I think that maybe goes a little bit too far. But it's some sort of inexplicable non-human presence in the house, and it's like, the tear that's been created by the presence of these people who can't move on. It's like that has attracted something that's kind of, like a worm in a piece of cheese. It's found a hole, and it's poked itself through into this world. So that's I mean, we've seen that in the Stone Tape and the Shining, and this idea of sort of manifestations of compounded of various different things that have sort of accumulated over the years.
It's a really wonderful concept, isn't it? And I like the way, I mean, barring her reference to it as the beast, which I don't think it's intended to be taken literally. I think she's just using the language that she knows, which has a kind of slightly sort of Abrahamic Christianic tone to it. The beast is obviously another name for the devil, or Satan, or Lucifer, and it's definitely not that. It's definitely not that. I mean, the metaphysics of this film, in fact, all the films, is really fascinating. It's really fascinating because it's a metaphysics where there is definitely an afterlife. I mean, there's no argument that there is some kind of continuation from life to death. I mean, in I think it's in Poltergeist 2 where it establishes that death is almost just like a metamorphosis. You may as well be a chrysalis when you're physically alive, and you become something far more abstract. You become sort of like a myth of yourself when you pass over. So if you were a very, 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 very bad person when you were alive, you become something really, really awful and hideous on the other side. But what's remarkably absent in all of the films is any kind of like authority overseeing it all. So there is no God in this metaphysics. Tangier, none of the people who seem to know what's going on make any reference to any kind of God or authority, or indeed any kind of opposite, really. All of the evil and all of the good is innately human. It's innately human. And I kind of love that.
Yeah, you do get that moment towards the end of the first film when Diane is trying to get into the room, and her way is being blocked by various things, like the spirit that blocks the door, and the wonderful shot of the corridor elongating into the distance.
So good.
And in order to, that's really great. That really struck me on this rewatch.
Yeah.
But she only gets in when she says, "God help me." But you don't have to take that literally. It doesn't have to be that she calls upon God and that's why at that moment she gets help. It can just be her own strength responding to that, I suppose.
And her
otherwise,
using the language that she knows, right? In order to summon that strength.
Otherwise, it does feel like a very new age kind of non-Manichaean universe, without a god, without a devil, but with spirits. Yeah. I mean, it's almost certainly in the second film. They make a point of this with Taylor's character.
Yeah.
It's almost animistic,
Yeah.
And it's in the first film as well, because the tree seems to have life, and all sorts of inanimate objects seem to have life.
Actually, it happens a lot, doesn't it? Actually, I mean, you get the snake crawling across the counter at one point.
Yeah,
that happens a lot. Actually, inanimate things having their own kind of animus that seems to be it's lent animus by not just the motive force of the supernatural, but by the perspectives of whoever's observing it. So the reason
you get that running joke in the second film about the car being angry. Even the car kind of has its own spirit.
Yeah, I mean, it's played for laughs in the second film, but it is tied in, isn't it? It really is tied in. When Taylor's driving it, it's fine. It just doesn't like Steve.
But that in itself is kind of a. If we take Diane and Stephen to be kids of the age of Aquarius, they grew up in the 60s and 70s, then it's like the film is saying, okay, so you've moved on into the era of the 80s, into the era of being homeowners and Ronald Reagan and so on, but this way of looking at things from your past is actually the more profound way of looking at things. Maybe this more spiritual, new age way of looking at things that was very prevalent with young people in the 60s and 70s. It still has a power, an underlying power that you can't get away from, no matter how much you grow up.
Yeah, that is fascinating, isn't it? Because that makes it a kind of journey. It makes it like a metaphysical journey for Steve and Diane, for the kids too, but primarily for Steve and Diane. It's like it's trying to reach and bring them back to a better, a more holistic way of looking at things that isn't blinkered by materialism and by the sort of poison of the 1980s of neoliberalism. I mean, the fact that the supernatural stuff starts manifesting through the television is no mistake. Obviously, it's no mistake, right? I mean, it does link to certain parapsychological notions of using electronics and whatnot to listen in on your half-heard conversations of the dead and so on and so forth. But it also has this really incredible sort of metaphorical freight. I mean, like the television.
And that again is something we've touched upon in the past when we looked at Exorcist 3. It's more developed in the novel than in the film version, but it is still present in the film version in hints. This idea of electronic media as being able to carry the signals from other realities, and that's there is a kind of grumpiness about consumerism throughout this, isn't there?
Oh, definitely.
I don't, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't really condemn the life that they live in Cuesta Verde, but it does imply that that there's something missing in the materialism of it all, because it makes a point of the television being the conduit, and you get that wonderful ending moment where Stephen they end up in the motel room and Stephen wheels the television into the motel room.
I love it.
It's a perfect ending.
Yeah, it really is. It's just like it's a final note, isn't it? It's like it is just that perfect final note. It's a little bit of levity. It's a joke, and yet because of what we've already seen, it's kind of sinister too, right? Because of the grander implications. I mean, if these spirits can come through this television, and the ownership of televisions as a sort of marker of middle class kind of neoliberal 1980s society is expanding and expanding and expanding. You could see how there could be almost like a Ghost Watch scenario in a later film, right, where there's a gigantic cross-community seance or something where hundreds of spirits and supernatural phenomena pour through. It could be, I mean, they could have taken it that way. It could have been quite incredible.
Yeah, and throughout the movie, there is, the evil spirit or the hostile spirits do manifest in things. They manifest in the television, in the clown, in that wonderful scene where he's showing the parapsychologists around the house for the first time, and the guy is telling him, "Oh, it's amazing. This shot we caught of a child's toy rolling across the floor all by itself. It took 7 hours, but if you watch it on time lapse." And Stephen doesn't say a single thing. He just opens the door for them, and the absolute chaos going on in that room. And it's all. But the thing is that it's all stuff, isn't it? It's light bulbs and toys, and it's like there is kind of this chaos of material things.
Yeah,
that's like running through the entire film.
It's a quiet. I mean, it's one of those films where it's very difficult to attribute any kind of negativity to it because it's just underlaid by this just incredible good feeling. But you're absolutely right. There is running throughout this contempt for the permanence of materiality, isn't there? Like the notion that we've got our house now and we've got our physical items, we've got all of our toys, and this is the way things are going to be forever, and this is going to keep us safe. This is our temple and our kingdom. We are the nuclear family, and we have our corporate town, we have our little household within it, and this is permanent and forever. This film takes a certain degree of pleasure in upending that completely.
Well, it actually ends with the house, the ultimate. Well, I mean, the swimming pool is a symbol throughout the movie as well. It's a symbol of their upward mobility, their success in the middle class. They're going to have the luxury of the swimming pool, etc. And it becomes this horrifying, dirty, muddy mess that's full of dead bodies. And then at the very end of the film, the entire house is consumed. It's like watching a piece of paper being scrunched up in somebody's hand. It's just completely collapsed down into a singularity.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? It's just a wonderful. Yeah. I mean, it is iconic. I mean, that's another one of the many, 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 many images from this film that is like it somehow permeated cultural consciousness, and as a result it's endlessly parodied in cartoons and comics and all sorts of things. I mean, I do believe there's a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror that does it. It recreates.
Well, how could there not, really?
But it recreates that entire sequence in animation. The only difference is that in the Treehouse of Horror, the reason the house does it is because it can't bear to live with the Simpsons.
Fantastic.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, that sequence with the pool at the. I mean, funnily enough, the pool is both it's both a symbol of their upward mobility, but also a sort of icon of horror, certainly for Diane, almost from the beginning. Because she's talking to Steve at various points where she's very worried about one of the kids falling into it, particularly Carol Ann. In fact, I think there are sequences where when she does go missing, when the first place they go is the swimming pool.
Yeah, exactly. It's a site of anxiety all the way through. So it's got this double-edged feeling to it, and the fact that it's kind of, it spends the entire movie in a state of construction, half started, half finished. It indicates a kind of eternal instability in that kind of social position.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, you get that wonderful sequence towards the end where Diane falls into it, and it's this horrible moment of vulnerability because she's already had that sequence that's a bit like. Have you ever seen The Entity? From the 1980s.
Yes.
Horrible. I mean, really grotty, vile, kind of exploitative, horrible film. But she has a sequence a bit like that, doesn't she? Where there's, I mean, it's an amazing special effect where she's rolling up the wall and across the ceiling. I mean, it's clear how they've done it. They've sort of constructed a bedroom, and they've where the floor is the ceiling, right? And she's making it look like she's rolling up the wall, and she's not. She's just rolling across the floor. But it's really good. It's a really wonderful sequence. But there is this horrible imagery in that, which is it's suggestive of a rape, isn't it? It's really, really uncomfortable, that sequence. And then she ends up falling into the pool. And the body, it's the way
the unseen force kind of pulls her shirt up, doesn't it? So there's an element of sort of sexual intimidation about what it's doing.
It's very unpleasant, very uncomfortable, that sequence. And again, it kind of has echoes in Poltergeist 2 when Steve. There's my favorite sequence in the entire film where Stephen is possessed by the tequila worm. And he also, I mean, that's a really horrible sequence, actually. I think that's probably the nastiest, most mean-spirited sequence in the entire series, to be honest, because it's attacking something that over the course of 1.5 films you've grown to really invest in, which is this family unit, and the relationship between Steve and Diane. It's attacking them at their most fundamental. But it has echoes there too. It's very, very unpleasant.
Yeah. But I think maybe we could move on to the second film a bit now, couldn't we?
Yeah, definitely.
That sequence in particular, I mean, it goes somewhere that the first film doesn't go. I mean, I like the fact that the first film doesn't do the thing where there are problems in the marriage, and Stephen needs to learn his lesson and appreciate his family or anything like that. I mean, if you were making a film like this now, there's no way that they wouldn't put in some sort of half-assed theme about conflict in the marriage that has to be overcome by the end of the film. And they don't do that at all in the first movie. And I really appreciate that. And then when you get to the second one, it kind of undermines that a bit. There's something very deliberate about the way it undermines that. And it's very much about one of the things that I love about, another thing that I love about the first film is how intensely female it is.
Yes.
Diane is much more the lead character than Stephen.
Yep.
And the events in the house are centered on Carol Ann. And then you have the very important character of the parapsychologist. And then of course you have Tangina, who comes in at the end. And all the really crucial stuff is done by the women.
By the women.
Although
they do tend to be either tertiary, they're just there to be almost like ciphers for the plot in many respects. That is generally the case. Or like for Robbie, for example. Robbie's a really good example of this. I mean, he's a really good character. He has his great set pieces, but really his purpose is to scream and alert the parents when something is happening around Carol Ann, right?
Yeah. Although interestingly, he is the one who comes up with the plan that ultimately works. He talks about, putting a rope around himself and going in to pull Carol Ann out. And that is ultimately what they do.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, you mentioned the wonderful character. I can never remember her name, but the parapsychologist, who is she's only in the film for 20 minutes, if that, of screen time, and she is wonderful, isn't she? Absolutely wonderful. She has the maternal role, she has the role that the grandmother has in the second film, which I imagine there are lots of reasons why that character didn't come back, but one of the reasons I can certainly see is she has in the first film this incredibly maternal relationship with Diane. And of course,
there's also a real friendship there as well, though, isn't there? I love how they bond with each other.
I think it's lovely. I think it really is lovely. The relationships are so well drawn, and they're so warm. They're so warm and real. And she is the one, of course, who says to Diane, "We are staying. We are staying, and we're going to see this through. We are not going to abandon you," which is really wonderful because they're shaken too. Of course, they are parapsychologists and they've been all over the place and they haven't really discovered very much that's that convincing, to be honest. And then they look into this. And they don't know what's going on either, right?
And another thing I love in the first movie is the fact that when Diane is in the other world looking for Carol Ann, with the rope around her, I mean, firstly, I love that we don't see what goes on in there. I think that's great.
That's key.
Many another film, even at the time, would have insisted upon taking you in there with her. And I love that we don't see it.
Me too.
But the other thing I love about that sequence is that Stephen does actually let go of the rope. There's this whole thing about before she goes in, she says, don't let go. And he says, never. And then the thing that the entity, whatever it is, it sort of pokes its head out, and it's so terrifying that Stephen does drop the rope. And I don't think there's no sort of implicit criticism of him. I mean, in that moment, who could blame anybody?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think
freezing in absolute terror.
Right. I don't think anyone was expecting that.
Yeah. No, but he does drop it.
Yeah, he does.
Which is a really interesting note to hit.
Especially since it's going wrong as well, isn't it? Like the plan is technically going wrong because before he drops the rope, one of the reason the thing which a lot of people now, of course, associate with the Reverend K, it is the face of the beast, and it's probably, retrospectively whatever that entity is, but he starts to pull on the rope, starts to draw Diane back before Tangina's plan is finished, and that's why the thing comes through. It's almost like it notices, it's like it realizes what's going on.
And you get this feeling that Tangina's kind of got her own fish to fry as well.
Definitely.
There's something a little bit cold about Tangina in this film. She's kind of, it's like she sees the bigger picture, and she wants to help the Freelings and get the little girl back if she can. But you get this hint that she's kind of at least as maybe even more concerned about the souls that are trapped in the house, and her priority is kind of them, and she'll get the mother and child back if she can, but she doesn't really share with them what she's planning.
She's not as sentimentally attached, is she? And as a result, she does play a few games. I mean, there are moments when, when she's telling Diane to tell Carol Ann to go towards the light, because of course she knows the souls will follow her there, and that's the way out for them. That's their salvation. And if of course we know, we've been told already that that light is the other side, right? That is, once you go through, that's it. You don't come back. You do not come back. You move on to some other plane of existence. And she can't possibly know that Carol Ann won't just run through it. You know, there's a sense that if it came to it, she would, or maybe, you know, sacrifice Carol Ann to get the rest of these souls to wherever they're supposed to be.
Yeah. She's very much got her eyes on the bigger picture, I feel. And, you know, she's prepared to sacrifice two people in order to help a lot more people.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it feels like she is aware of the incredible injustice that's been done here on a level that's beyond the political or beyond the historical. It's the metaphysical, right? And it feels like she feels it in a very intense and intimate way, and feels that it has to be redressed. It has to be healed somehow. Otherwise, it's a wound that's just going to keep getting worse, right? It's just going to keep bleeding, and it's going to spread and fester and become worse and worse and worse. And of course, she is right. She is absolutely right about that, even though she's wrong about a lot of other stuff as well, like the notion that the house is clear, for example. It ain't.
Yeah, another little character note with her is the way she preens herself for the camera.
Yes,
that's kind of her weak spot, isn't it? She's a bit vain.
Yeah,
and I think she assumes that she's done her stuff, so now everything's sorted. That's probably where that mistake comes from.
It does feel that way.
It's all suggested with little character notes like that. It's really nicely done.
It's very clever.
But yeah, there is.
Sorry, I mean, like, there are no like throwaway sequences where, you know, it cuts away and you see Tangina maybe talking to someone, or you know, there's a sly look or anything like that. It doesn't do that. It's not that blunt with its characters. It's just little subtle suggestions of what their agendas and motives might be. It's actually really well done in that regard. It's a bit of a work of craft, this one.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's no longueurs. There's no areas of the script where things just stop for no reason at all. Even the quiet scenes further the characterization, and it has a real.
I mean, I love the fact that it takes quite a long time to establish its setting and its characters and their relationships to one another. I think that gives it real investment and weight when things start to sort of impact upon that situation. It makes you invested, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the characters feel very real.
Yeah.
Precisely because there's no real attempt to do heavy-handed themizing, if you know what I mean. They're just setting up characters and relationships.
Yeah, that's it. It's very simple in many respects, and yet at the same time it has these sort of hidden depths that are just wonderful to explore, really, really wonderful to engage with. And that does carry over to the second film. I mean, there are enormous problems with the second film. I mean, it was a very troubled production, for one thing, for lots of different reasons. But there are also problems with there are problems with certain aspects of the writing. I mean, you mentioned before there's the ending sequence, which was originally supposed to be very, 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 very different from what we actually get, and that's very clear. There is the problem of Taylor, which is very 1980s, very 1980s horror. Bearing in mind that this is the era when, like, Stephen King was at his absolute apex, and so the qualities that one would associate with Stephen King's writing, but not just Stephen King. I mean, it's unfair to tar him exclusively with that brush, but he does seem to be like the emblem of it. It was just everywhere in horror, wasn't it? This dynamic of the sort of magic ethnic character whose only purpose really is to save the white family.
Yeah, it does have the second film does have much more of a sort of Stephen King-ish feel about it. Now that you mention it, that's a really good call.
It does. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think I mean, even given that, and even given the problematics of Taylor's sort of place in the story and his representation, thematically it kind of works. Given what we've already discussed about this film, the notion that it is about the return of the repressed, that it is about sort of like buried history, it kind of works in that regard, because it is pointing directly at the deeper history of the USA as a culture, right? And the evils that erupt from that. The fact that you've got Taylor counterposed to the very icon of the American nation, the founders and settlers of the American nation, the white priest who's leading his flock of settlers across the land, right? That's very, very interesting. Yeah. I can kind of see. I kind of like the film for that,
Absolutely. It's very fundamental. It's, native versus pilgrim.
Yeah.
It sets up a direct opposition, between Cain, who is the settler, the Christian patriarch,
yeah.
The white man, etc., against Taylor, who represents the native peoples, and it gives Taylor. This is another thing I was going to mention before, which is that the first film is extremely female.
Yep.
And this film does actually. The second film actually does some interesting stuff with that, because it still is the key relationships in the second film are still female.
Yep.
Diane and Caroline and her mother, Caroline's grandmother.
Yeah.
And of course the grandmother is crucial to the resolution of the of the film at the very end. And Tangina's in it again, etc., as a sort of guiding spirit behind everything that happens. Her further researches into what happened in the house are behind the whole thing, really. So it keeps that it very, very faithfully keeps that feel of a female orientation, which is very, very unusual in these sorts of films.
Especially,
but it does also, But the second film does also kind of start thinking about masculinity, doesn't it? Because
it really does.
Taylor, for all that we would have our issues with the whole sort of idea of the magical Native American, the magical person of color, it's very appropriating and sort of inherently condescending, etc., etc. Native Americans become these magical spiritual people, etc. I mean, the problems with that are very obvious. But at the same time, Taylor is really he's the embodiment of a healthy and constructive form of masculinity in this film.
It's absolutely true.
Even when he voices quite patriarchal attitudes, when he talks to Diane about the fact that she doesn't know what it's like to be a man.
It's great, isn't it?
He talks about.
He says, "What is it?" He says to her. She says something like, "I can't remember what she says to him, but he says like, how would you know how it feels to be a man?"
Yeah, but then she says, "You don't know what it's like to be a mother."
Yep.
And there's no. You get the feeling of sort of perspectives that are clashing at that moment, but are not actually in conflict.
Yeah.
And he's teaching Robbie about being a warrior, etc., and about protecting his family. So there is a classic masculine idea to that. But again, it's like a healthy version of that. And counterposed to that, you have the deeply unhealthy version of masculinity embodied by Cain, which is all about domination
and authority.
That version of patriarchy, which is intensely
it's almost Freudian at times, isn't it? Bringing Giger on to design like the monster versions of Cain was an absolute stroke of genius, because of course you get exactly what you get in like the Alien films, which is the monstrous forms of Cain become essentially big phalluses, when he takes the form of the worm in the tequila, and then you get that wonderful inverse birth sequence, which is one of my favorite effects shots in the entire series. I've got to say, I love the wetness and the lymphiness and the grotesquerie of it. I mean, it recalls the Alien birth, but it also recalls like Frank rising from the floorboards in Hellraiser. You get another sort of inverse birth sequence there. The fact that it's Cain, so it's something dead being born from a man. I mean,
a male birth. Yes.
right, giving birth to something awful, something truly unholy, right? I mean,
Yeah, it is. It is very good, that monster.
I love that, but the fact that that creature is kind of phallic, when it grows, when it becomes the big kind of Medusa-headed sort of pillar of hideousness, there is something very, very phallic about it. It's almost like what it's manifesting is impotence in a way. It's kind of the power of impotence and the power of ultimate masculine negativity. It's not masculinity as a creative force, as Taylor embodies, as we see, something that's connected to life and to virility. It's something that's connected to death and or everything thanatic, to rot. It's just wonderful. It's just wonderful stuff.
Yeah, and it's the real. I mean, it's kind of the old shoulder angel versus shoulder demon thing. You have Taylor on the one side, and on the other you have Cain, and in the middle you have Stephen.
Yeah.
And whereas the first film doesn't really show you anything particularly negative about Stephen at all,
Nope.
which in its own way I really appreciate. In this film, it does allow us to dig into Stephen's insecurities a bit, and you have Stephen feeling very insecure about his ability to protect his family and his ability to live up to that kind of patriarchal masculine ideal. And he starts drinking.
Yeah.
And ultimately, when Cain first comes to the house, Cain tries to get in via exploiting Stephen's insecurities, about exploiting Stephen's resentment of his wife and his daughter, and his feelings of impotence and his inability to protect them and stuff like that, and his feeling of lacking authority over the family. Cain plays on that. That's his line of attack, and he's trying to get in via Stephen, because it's implied Stephen is actually the weakest link in the chain. He is the one, precisely because he is subject to those sorts of fears that come from this version of masculinity. And then Stephen gets literally penetrated and impregnated by Cain via the booze that he's drinking. He started to booze, which is the classic. I mean, again, it's all the way through movies of this era and slightly earlier. I mean, The Shining, obviously, it's about a man who drinks too much and who is deeply wounded by his own feelings of inadequacy and his inability to live up to his toxic masculine attitudes. And there's, even in the Amityville Horror, that's very much a similar thing to what happens in The Shining. There's this idea of the evil force seducing the vulnerable male father figure through his own insecurities, and that involves drink as well. So you get a reproduction of that running theme throughout these sorts of movies in Stephen, and it literally ends up with him swallowing this sort of little phallic worm with one eye, and it turns him into the worst possible version of himself. It makes him sexually violent to his wife.
It does,
and it makes him say
like the worst
dreadful things to him.
The worst things, and you get the impression that this is not just Cain. It's not just Cain talking. What he's doing is actually, like you said, bringing out all of the sublimated neuroses, the darkness that is as festered within Stephen as a direct result of what happened in Cuesta Verde, right? That, I mean, we get intimations of that very early on, because of course they are. I mean, he does feel inadequate because of course he had to leave his high-paying job. They had nothing after, of course. I mean, they've been trying to get some recompense from the company for God knows how long and getting nowhere. They've got nothing. They've got no insurance. They've got nothing. There's that wonderful sequence again, another really, really wonderful establishing sequence where him and Diana kind of having an argument, but not really, because they don't argue really, do they? Where he turns it into a joke. He turns it into a joke, where he says, we could just go, get in the car. I'll be a traveling salesman, I've got to be free. He's playing up, and it's fun. He's making her laugh. He's turning that moment of tension into a moment of brevity, it's fun. But at the same time, you do get the impression that those are very genuine and sincere insecurities that have been bubbling away inside him, because of course they're living with her mother, They're not living
But
the American dream anymore.
No, exactly. And he is still, the film doesn't go too far. It doesn't backtrack on who he fundamentally is. It still allows for the fact that Stephen is fundamentally a healthy personality who does have perspective and does have a sense of humor. But it's like, it's in a way, it's even more radical what it's saying for that, because what it's saying, even in a guy like this, if you get him at the wrong time and you say the right things, you can, those insecurities and those thoughts are there even in a man like this. Patriarchy is that suffocating and that infiltrating.
Exactly that, and that's of course linked to the subtle criticisms of neoliberalism and of capitalism and of what that enjoins men to be, the identities that it imposes upon us, which we can never live up to, right? We can never live up to, regardless of what circumstances we find ourselves in. We're always going to be inadequate. And for Stephen, it's even worse, of course, because he's had all of them have been sort of ground up and spat out by the engine, right? Everyone is kind of a victim here, regardless.
Yeah, and you get this really interesting note when you go back to Questa Verde. It's like Questa Verde has kind of become a dump.
It's dead,
since
right?
the first movie.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting note, and they don't do anything with it, but in a way, it's really good. They just put it there, and they just let it lie there for whatever you want that to mean.
Yeah, it doesn't like go out of its way to say.
It's kind of abandoned.
Yeah, and it doesn't go out of its way to say, oh, this is because of the supernatural stuff. This happened because of these events, so many years ago when a house literally folded in on itself. It's almost like, again, it almost ties into the themes of the first film, and which run through the second film too. This is just the nature of these settlements, because these towns are built by corporations, and corporations are by their very nature mercurial and ephemeral. They're doomed to die. They're doomed to decay,
Yeah, there is just something fundamentally fake about them. And it's like what happened to the Freelings house was like a pinprick that caused the entire inflatable bouncy castle to slowly start deflating.
Yeah, right. So the confection is kind of crumbling in on itself. Yeah. The Freelings was more extreme.
That's a really interesting note.
I love. That is something I noticed definitely this time watching it, when they do go back to Questa Verde, and it's not like the camera doesn't linger over it. You don't get any there are no cues in the score that are telling you that this is the case. It just lets you see it, and that's it.
Yeah. And then again in this film, you have that feeling of historical wounds compounded and accumulating, because what you find in this film, they retrofit some new continuity into the story. What you find in the second film is that underneath the graveyard, you have this other graveyard, these people, these bodies left in this cave, who were settlers and members of a cult, a doomsday cult no less, who were led there by this fanatical preacher, who was also obviously a cult leader. There's hints of Jonestown and all these sorts of things in there. So what it's like, at the most fundamental basic level, right the way, beneath the foundations of the house, beneath the graveyard that was there, even down into the subterranean levels of this place, you have again this historical tragedy that's directly based upon the settlement of the West, that's directly based upon patriarchy and Christianity and manifest destiny. And again, the presence of Taylor, for all that there are problems with the representation, it puts that into direct conflict with Taylor. Which,
it really does.
There's something quietly radical about that.
I think so. For all you can, and it is a legitimate criticism. Taylor is that trope. He is the magic ethnic character. His positioning in the film is actually really radical and really interesting, because everything associated with Taylor, visually, the way he speaks, what he represents, is virile and positive. it's a powerfully colourful and vibrant and wonderful representation of positive masculinity. There's that wonderful sequence with the butterflies and whatnot, which is genuinely wonderful. It's okay. Again, yeah, it's really tropey, and it's problematic in its own peculiar ways. The notion that because he's Native American, of course he's obviously connected to the world and nature and so on and so forth. But there is something really wonderful symbolically about it. There really is. And when you compare and contrast it to what the Reverend Cain represents, which is, of course, the manifest destiny of white and West and of the USA as a culture, and everything he represents is thanatic. Everything, even his metaphysics is thanatic. I mean, there is a note that I found really interesting this time, which is when Tangina turns up again at the Freeling's house, and it's that great sequence where again you get this compounding of the female character's significance to this metaphysics, where she insists to Diane that she is powerfully clairvoyant, like Carol Ann, like her mother, which she is. She absolutely is. Tangina says that Cain was a powerful medium in life. So he has some awareness of what this metaphysics is and what could potentially happen after they sealed all of his followers in this cave and they all die. You almost get the impression that maybe it wasn't a case of accident or delusion, that maybe he was almost trying to foster this transition into this other condition, this manifestation of pure negativity, a thing of incredible power. That's definitely true. I mean, his influence is incredible, but he is thanatic. It's something that's ultimately monstrous and cannot create anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's implied that what he's, I mean, as I say, there is a note of Jonestown in what happens to his cult. And I feel, I mean, just as what happened when Jim Jones murdered all those people, and it was mass murder, not mass suicide. Absolutely. When he murdered all those people, what he was doing was he was exercising the ultimate control over them, the ultimate ownership of them. Because he was this monstrous sociopathic narcissist. And you get the feeling in the film that that's what Cain is doing as well. And if he is a powerful medium, then I think it's implied very quietly that what he's trying to do is create sort of slaved spirits. Spirits of people who are slaved to himself. And that's certainly what he seems to want Carol Ann for. I mean, again, it's a recurring trope in these sorts of stories, and again, it's very Stephen King-y. But it's like the psychically gifted child. I mean, the scene where Carol Ann and the grandmother have a conversation, it's very reminiscent of the scene in The Shining when Halloran and Halloran have the conversation.
Very much so.
And that, I mean, it's implied, I think, that what Cain wants from Carol Ann is that she's kind of a way in which he can regain control of his flock, as it were. I think that's what he wants her for. He wants to use her power to re-establish control. So it's still this battle for ownership over the souls of these people.
I mean,
which is quite powerful.
It's so unpleasant, isn't it? The notion that there's a metaphysics here that can become like the narcissist's ultimate dream, in the most hellish way imaginable, where you have souls that are ultimately enslaved to them for eternity, that they can do, they're effectively toys. They can do what they like with them.
Well, it's interesting because that is an idea that pops up again and again in the minds of psychopaths, serial killers. I mean, that's one of the things that David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, talked about. He talked about, the people that he killed would be his slaves in the afterlife, and several people like that have said the same sort of thing. It seems to be a recurrent fantasy with these sorts of people.
Oh, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, on a completely different note, can we just say, give a round of applause for Julian Beck for his performance in this film?
Oh, he's a really great. I think he's absolutely one of the great cinema villains from the 80s.
I think so.
It's a wonderful performance. I mean, firstly, the conception of the character is really great. I love the idea of the villain being this this preacher type cult leader man from settler times. And then Julian Beck, who's really interesting guy. He was kind of this radical avant-garde theatre producer and stuff like that.
Fascinating, right?
He gives an amazing performance, a really subtle, quiet, carefully modulated performance. Yeah, that's there's no ham about it whatsoever. It's all subtle,
right.
But it's incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, it's wonderful what he does. I mean, from the moment he appears, first of all, the guy looks amazing. He just when the camera's on him, he's one of those people that the camera just adores. You cannot help but look at him. You can't help it. Your eyes just whoosh right to him. But there's also the way he chooses to play it. I mean, this could have been hammy, couldn't it? This could have been really, really ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
It could have so easily gone overboard. But he does that wonderful sort of like feathery, light, kind of very charming, charismatic performance. You know, when he first encounters Carol Ann and he has that voice. Are you lost, sweetheart? Are you afraid, darling?
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's seductive and threatening at the same time.
And what I particularly love, and it's partly him and it's partly the writing, is that Kane never breaks character.
Yeah.
He there's never a moment where he sort of seems to stop pretending and say, now I shall show my true. His story, his fake story that he tells Stephen. And his fake persona that he takes on, it never breaks. Even at the end of that amazing confrontation scene where he's screaming, "You're going to die!"
Right.
It's still based upon the bullshit story that he's told Stephen.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that Kane Kane appears obviously later on as a monster, but there is no scene where he sort of casts the mask aside and says, I shall reveal my true evil plan. Ha 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 ha. He just, it's like that's all he's got. All he's got is his lies. He's just a creature of lies. There's nothing to him but that. Right?
Yeah, and that's what he became, right? I mean, that's another interesting note in this film. It's not explicit at all, but you almost get the impression that whatever this entity is, it is not necessarily the man Reverend Kane. It's almost like what he gave birth to, through his actions, through the horrific kind of genocide that he enacted. It's almost like Kane was the cipher and the pupae for this entity. All of that negativity that swirled around him gave birth to this thing. Because there is definitely a suggestion from Tangina that he's deluded himself. Right, he doesn't realize that he's dead. Yeah, absolutely. He, in his own way, he is lost as well. Yeah, which is fascinating.
He's just operating. Yeah, and as far as he's concerned, he's just operating on the same priorities and drives that he had in life.
Yeah,
which that's really clever.
Yeah, it is very really clever. I mean, for a horror, it's a horror sequel, of a popular film from the 1980s, and they tend to be terrible, don't they? They tend to be hot garbage. Let's be fair. There are a couple of exceptions. There are things like Hellraiser 2, which is a really excellent piece of work, flawed but
masterpiece.
Beautiful film, absolutely stunning film. This is another one, I think, massively flawed. It has real problems, but at the same time, I don't think it betrays the first film. I think it really expands upon the metaphysics of the first film and does it really beautifully. I think the themes are carried over really, really well, even when they are problematically manifested. I think it deepens them and it swells them and it makes them more acute in many respects. One of the only really big bum notes for me is the end.
Yeah. it is excessively syrupy, I'm afraid.
It is, and it's a bit of a
the
cop out as well, isn't it? I mean, you get the impression that maybe they ran out of time or money to get the sequence that they wanted, because there's a little bit of magic bullshittery at the end, isn't there? You know, I mean, I know it's a film that generally deals with metaphysics and a kind of magic anyway, but that moment, I really do let out a groan at that moment when they're in the sort of swirling miasma of the other side, and when the family comes together, and you get that truly awful chord of music that happens. I mean, truly god awful, overblown, and that you get the lights around them, and it's like, oh, come on. You spent the first film,
and the
kind of undoing the notion of the sort of prescribed nuclear family, and now you're kind of making it, you know, you are actually putting it up on the pedestal again. It's like, come on.
Yeah, and the angelic grandmother ex machina as well is a bit hard to take.
It's a bit hard to swallow. I mean, there are great things in that
and it does.
There are good things in that sequence. I love Kane himself is amazing. That monster is absolutely spectacular. I love it. The moment ever since I was a kid, it's always really disturbing. The moment when he actually grabs Carol Ann, and his influence is so corrosive that it turns her into like a corpse, you know?
Yeah.
I've always had a moment with that, you know. It's like,
but I just feel like it is fundamentally mistaken, because I was saying that there is one of the great things about the first movie is that it won't show you the other dimension. It won't go through with Diane to show you what it's like on the other side of the door, you know. And this film, the second film, does that. It takes you into the interstitial. Yeah, because it's not, you know, nothing can really live up to how it's been built up.
Of course.
You have the rather awkward-looking effect of them floating, and it's very obvious that they're against a green screen on strings.
On wires, yes.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame.
It's fairly obvious, yes. And it is a shame, because there was a sequence planned, wasn't there? And it was all designed. You know, Giger designed pretty much all of it, by all accounts, that was going to be much weirder than this. Going to be in classic H.R. Giger style, right? It was going to be much stranger, but they just couldn't realize it. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it just couldn't be realized, and that is a great shame. I would have loved to have seen the sort of Giger designed ending to this film.
Yeah, but there's very obviously a fair bit less money to spend in the second film.
Oh yeah, that's kind of obvious. I mean, don't get me wrong, the things that are in it are generally really good. I mean, I love most of the special effects sequences in this film. It's that moment with the inverse birth, and the way that thing evolves under the bed into the limbless kind of wet Reverend K. It's so good. And if you watch the way it hideously squirms across the floor in this impotent wormy way, and it leaves that trail of just muck, of filth, and you've got Diane and Steve just absolutely appalled at what they're witnessing. It's a great sequence, you know.
It is. One of the things we were talking about with the first film is how interested it is in textures and surfaces and material things, you know, from the wonderful bit with the sort of side of beef that sort of erupts with maggots, and the scene where the guy tears his own face off, and the ectoplasm on the rope and all that. And the second film carries that through, and in a way it gets a bit nastier and a bit weirder with some of that.
It does. I mean, bringing Giger on is going to do that, isn't it? You know, it does get much nastier, I think. Even the physical stuff in the first film, even the physical stuff is kind of lurid, isn't it? It has this sort of ghost train ride feeling to it. It's all very colourful and I mean, even when you see the manifestation of the beast, you know, in the first film, that wonderful creature that appears before Diane in front of the kid's bedroom towards the end, that amazing.
I love that.
It's so good.
That's one of my favorite monsters in all cinema. I love how it moves. I love how it's similar. Well, I mean, again, I was saying that the film kind of does the does the material monsters and the spectral ghosts thing. It does them both. And the wonderful thing about that monster in front of the bedroom door is that it combines both approaches. It is both material and bodily, but at the same time, it is kind of spectral, with its floating hair and the wonderful way it moves. And I love that monster.
It's kind of insectile and slightly sort of feline at the same time. It is just wonderful. Just wonderful. And of course, I mean, people
roars.
Yeah, and of course, people retrospectively, it does look, bizarrely, it does look a little bit like the Reverend Kane, doesn't it? It does look a little bit like Julian Beck in a kind of distorted way. And of course, people have retrospectively said, well, that's the Reverend Kane, that's the Beast, right? Which is I'm fine with. I'm fine with allowing for that, But yeah,
I'm quite happy to sort of.
Yeah.
I'm quite happy to let the first film stand on its own and then sort of watch the second film again on its own terms. Just let the second film use the first film for what it wants to do with it. I'm not so worried about thinking about the second film when I'm watching the first one.
No, absolutely. I mean, in terms of continuity is always an issue with these things, because of course they didn't intend to. When the first film is established, they don't necessarily intend to make a sequel. They don't know if it's going to be popular, right? Otherwise, there would have been a lot more sort of direct hints to what's going on even deeper underneath the initial graveyard. I cannot remember for the life of me, because the remake it's so frictionless. I can never remember. I can't retain anything about it, like nothing. A few moments I retain, a few moments in it, but I watch it and I forget it. It's gone from my mind. So I don't know whether that if it does make reference to the wider mythology or whatever, or if there's any sort of suggestion of the stuff with Cain or whatever. I don't think there is. I don't recall there being, but then again, as I say, I don't recall very much about that film at all.
I saw it once not long after it came out, and the only thing I really remember about it is that Jared Harris, isn't it? Because I love Jared Harris.
Me too.
And he plays the equivalent. Yeah, he plays the equivalent to the Tangina character in that movie. But apart from that, I don't remember anything about it at all, except that it very much sort of goes the other way on the female dynamics of the first film.
And it's very much
it'll be interesting to see that again.
Yeah, it will. I mean, I have resisted watching it up till this point, because it is one of those films that by and large my memory of it is just kind of tasteless and frictionless. It doesn't have. I can't get a bead on it. I can't sort of get it. It doesn't seem to have any of the qualities that means that it's going to latch onto my mind. So it is going to be an interesting experience. I mean, and one thing that does profoundly put me off is the fact that it's a film of it's the mid 2000s, isn't it, this one? And it does that thing that we've spoken about before. It's that damn blue filter. It's that damn blue filter, the whole damn film. And I don't understand why you would take a film like Poltergeist, which is so technicolor, right, where the color palette is all over the place. It's like orange and it's amber and it's red and it's gold and it's all over the place. The colors are like almost Dario Argento, and then drain all that color out of it.
Oh, it's just kind of an obligatory house style, wasn't it, at that point in time? I don't know. I feel like
so hate it.
There was a rash of these. There was a rash of these remakes from the mid to the late 2000s. They remade Poltergeist. They remade Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They remade Nightmare on Elm Street. They remade The Omen. They remade loads of things. And Amityville Horror got a remake. And I don't know. I feel like there was just this. There was such a lack of confidence in the genre at that point in time, in the genre of horror. They'd gotten as far as recognizing that they had this back catalogue of stuff. But the only thing they could think to do with it was to sort of do remakes with middling budgets, and make them very quote unquote dark and gritty and stuff like that, and give them this dour look because again there's no confidence in it, so they think of the old 80s ones, they think of Nightmare on Elm Street and so on as silly, so if we're going to do it now for the present day, we desperately have to make it not silly. So what you do is you turn all the lights down and you put a blue filter on it, and everybody's frowning and all the relationships are negative and stressful, and it's very lazy.
Yeah, it is lazy, and I would, don't get me wrong. I don't have like an innate negative reaction to remakes. Some of the best films I've ever seen are remakes. The Thing is technically a kind of remake, or rather a readaptation of the same story, as the 1950s film. But the problem with that particular rash of remakes is they do this very particular thing where they completely ignore context. Like completely, they demonstrate a lack of understanding of why the original films worked in the eras in which they were produced, because of course those films, as we've discussed, as we've demonstrated, very acutely reflect cultural concerns of the time. Those films, the remakes of the 2000s, reflect nothing. They're just empty. They're vapid, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why certain films stick in the mind and in the culture so resolutely. That's why Texas Chainsaw Massacre has become such an iconic, integral part of culture in the way that it has. It's because it really hooks directly into something about America at that point in time, at the time of the Vietnam War. And, as the quote unquote 60s were decaying into what they became and stuff like that. It's like some films just have that ability to have that. They find this power cable that connects them right into the zeitgeist, the spirit of the moment. And what you end up with 20, 30 years later is, from the point of view of a movie company executive, is a known brand, a brand name that sells DVDs. So you have Nightmare on Elm Street, you have Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's a brand, and it's safe. And if we can put a moderate amount of money and some pretty teenagers, and a director who's just off some adverts and a couple of music videos, and we don't have to pay him very much. If we can put a relatively small amount of money into producing 90 minutes of stuff that we can make a trailer out of with a known brand name on it, we can make a little bit of money. That's really the only concern. That's really the only concern. So you end up with like these products of the factory system.
Yeah, they are anti-narrative, aren't they? They're anti-art. They're anti-story, because there's no story to be told. There's nothing to reflect. There's nothing.
They're not tied into anything.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, an example of doing it right tells you everything you need to know. We've talked about it. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers remake.
Right. Right.
It hooks directly into the anxieties of its era in the same way that the first version hooks directly into the anxieties of its era.
Yep.
Because the people making it are actually invested and interested in what they're doing. They've worked out that they have a metaphor here that they can do something interesting with, and they're intelligent enough about the society and the time that they're working in, that they create something that has that iconicness completely in its own right.
Yeah, and you see it with the remakes that work. You see it again and again. I mean, the one I often go back to is Cronenberg's The Fly. Of course, I mean the original. Yeah. The original Vincent Price film is kind of it's slightly hokey, but it's about its concerns about scientific progress and so on and so forth. It's a slightly Frankensteinian film, whereas Cronenberg's The Fly is a completely different animal. Those concerns are definitely there, but what it's primarily concerned with are escalating knowledge in sort of popular public consciousness of things like cancer and of AIDS and whatnot, and that the film, that because the film is so reinvented, it takes on an entirely new patina. It has this entirely new resonance, and as a result of that, works beautifully. And it's not always conscious
Absolutely, it's another
either.
perfect example.
I mean, it's not always a conscious thing either. I mean, I know that Carpenter has been interviewed about about The Thing, lots of times, and he said, we did not consciously realize that we were making this film that has all of these sublimated concerns in it about AIDS, about infection, about this escalating public awareness of health issues and of communicable disease. We did not understand that as such, not on a conscious level, but it's definitely there. The concerns are in the material innately because they were within us, the creators of that material. So as long as you allow art to breathe, as long as you allow the stories to be what they want to be, you will get that. You will get something that you can latch onto. But these entirely contrived, tightly controlled, contained remakes and sort of pieces of work that are created by committee ultimately, and they're edited by test audience. You get this work that is just, it's not even work, is it really? It's a thing, it's a product. Yeah, it just repulses me. It really does, especially in a genre that is, by its very nature, it's designed to arouse. It's supposed to arouse you on some way. You're supposed to feel something. Ugh.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And to do it to films like this as well, to do it to films like this, not to get too proprietorial about it and too sort of like old man get off my lawn, but to do it to films like this, which are kind of like sacred artifacts of the genre, that upsets me a lot. I've got to say, that does upset me a lot.
Well, in my own defense, I don't think it is a case of get off my lawn. For instance, the recent Suspiria remake.
Yes.
Suspiria is a movie that's very important to me, and they went ahead and made a new version of it, and it's a film. The remake is a film that's very different to the original. It has its own set of concerns, and I love it because it is a work of art in its own right.
I'll be honest,
has its own deep interests.
I avoided that for the longest time because I love the original Suspiria. I think the original Suspiria is it's a piece of art that is so elevated and so much its own entity. I just can't get over how good it is. And I avoided the remake for the longest time until someone said to me, no, watch it. No, go. You need to give it a chance, okay? Because in my mind, my attitude was, well, why would you? Why? It's like remaking Don't Look Now. Why would you do it? And then I watched it. I watched it quite recently, actually. I think I watched it for the first time last year, and you know what? I was mesmerized. I was utterly. It's breathtakingly good, isn't it? It's really its own entity, right? It's its own. That's it. Why would you remake Suspiria? The answer is you don't. You take the settings and the dynamics of the film, and then you make it into something that's different, that's something else, that explores different concerns, and does it beautifully. I mean, absolutely stunningly. I was bowled over by it. I sat and watched it and could not take my eyes off it.
Another one of my absolute favorite movies of all time, I mean, definitely in my top 5, is Herzog's remake of Nosferatu.
Yeah,
the 1979 Nosferatu.
Oh, it's a masterpiece.
That's a remake.
It's an absolute masterpiece, right? Yeah. Total.
And now they're doing another one. I mean, I love both of those, both the original Murnau one from the 20s and the remake from the 70s. They're both very dear to me.
Yeah.
And they're making another one now, and I'm really excited to see it because it's Robert Eggers.
Right. I mean, I would, under almost any other circumstances, my heart would drop. I would be thinking, oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no. Robert Eggers, bring it on. Bring it on. Yeah. I'm very, very happy. In fact, that excites me. That him and that material, that's almost perfect. That is almost perfect marriage of material and director, isn't it? Yeah, very interested to see what he does with that. And apparently, I mean, I was reading earlier, there has been talk of a remake or another remake of Poltergeist since 2019, apparently. Whether it will ever transpire, who knows? Who knows? But again, if they get if they can somehow get the right people involved, if they can actually create something, because this material is almost universal. You could so easily make a decent film that out of Poltergeist that reflects what's going on now in culture so beautifully and so easily. It could be wonderful. It just needs that space to breathe. It needs the right people behind it. That's all it needs.
It needs somebody who genuinely appreciates the original film and is also at the same time genuinely interested in making something new that grows out of it. Really.
It is a difficult balance.
It's that simple, really, isn't it?
But it is such a difficult balance to get right, because I've also seen remakes of things that are so slavish to the original films that you're sort of like, well, what's the point? Why just go and watch the original, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that's Poltergeist 1 and 2.
Absolutely.
And, we're going to. Sadly, we didn't have Elliot with us for this one, but he had other stuff he had to do, so he told us to go ahead without him. But I think we're going to team up with Elliot again at some point, hopefully, for some interesting more new ideas that we have for other things to talk about. But before that, I think you and I are going to team up again to talk about Poltergeist 3 and the remake, aren't we?
Definitely are. We definitely are. Because again, really interesting pieces of work, right? Flawed but interesting. Definitely for Poltergeist 3 anyway.
Well, as I say, I don't really remember anything about the remake, but I don't know. But 3, 3 is definitely by far the least impressive of the 3 original movies. But there is some interesting stuff going on in there, I think.
Isn't there?
So,
isn't there just? I think people are often surprised when they come to Poltergeist 3 of the stuff that actually happens in it.
Yeah, it's undeniably a bit shonky, but I do kind of love it.
Me too. I will happily watch it as part of a trilogy, a triptych. I will happily sit and watch Poltergeist 1, 2, and 3, and enjoy them all for whatever flaws they might have. But before we go, Jack, is there anything you'd like to pimp out?
Well, there's my main podcast, which is I Don't Speak German, which I do with my friend Daniel Harper, where we talk about the right, the far right, and the attendant paraforms of the right that we have everywhere now. Sadly,
the swell of material there.
Yeah, YouTube reactionaries and stuff like that. We have an episode coming up which is about the whole Steven Crowder versus Ben Shapiro thing.
Oh wow!
Whereas other shows would go into that itself, we sort of cover that, and then in line with the way we normally do things, we look at the wider reactions to it in the wider reactionary media sphere. So that's kind of our thing. So if that sounds interesting, check out I Don't Speak German at Libsyn, and we're in all the podcast apps and so on. And I have a Patreon, and if you want to give me a single $1 a month, you can get access to bonus episodes that Daniel and I do, usually about movies and other things like this. My Patreon subscribers will get this a little bit earlier than everybody else, and essays that I write a bit earlier than they're published and things like that. And what I write goes up at Eruditorium Press. So there you go. That's my stuff.
Fabulous stuff. Links, by the way, ladies and gents, links to all of that down below. And
my Twitter is @_Jack_Graham_. There you go.
Excellent. Again, links below. As for myself, ladies and gents, you can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy as per usual. There's always lots of stuff going on over here. You can also find me over at a new channel now, which is Our Lives in Horror, which is a channel dedicated to discussions with creators from the small press and independent horror community, which is really, really fun. Got some, there's lots of stuff lined up for that one, actually. Lots and lots of podcasts occurring at the moment, which is why my voice is maybe a little hoarse at the minute. You can also find links to all of my published work over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And if you would like to chat, you can come and find me over at Twitter on Enigmatic Elegy. Jack, that was great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we've been boiling this one away for a little while now, but that was really, really wonderful, you know?
Absolutely my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Me too. And thank you guys for listening along with us. Until next time, bye-bye.